Thanks very much to Tom and Declan for inviting me to present here today. The title of my presentation is Clinical Trial Project Management, and that's a short sentence for an enormous amount of work that has to be done to deliver a trial. And I just have 25 minutes today, so this is kind of like my warning that this is a whistle-stop tour. It's going to be fast. I'm going to cut through an awful lot of information very quickly, and I'll probably leave things out. So you can point it out to me afterwards if you like, and I can change the presentation.
You don't need to speak directly into that. Okay. Feedback a little bit, so just
keep it out. Is that a bit better? I'm not like too tinny now. Okay, you got that? So just to say that there's a lot to be covered in 25 minutes. I'm sure I'll leave stuff out. You can point it out to me after, but bear in mind that we're covering a very big topic in a short period of time. Over the course of my presentation, I'm going to cover three main sections. I'm going to look at clinical trial project management responsibilities and again touch that on a high level. We're going to look at the clinical trial life cycle itself and look at clinical trial project management for the life cycle, the whole life cycle of a clinical trial. And then I'll touch a little bit on clinical trial planning and the different tools that are out there that you can use for planning clinical trials. So moving on into the first section, general clinical trial project management responsibilities, and I'm going to set the scene and just so they're all on the same page, point out some of the basics. And I'm very pleased that Rabia was before me this morning because she covered so much of this in so much detail already. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to give you a few introductions. So the types of studies, as you know, there's investigational medicinal products, there's medical devices, there's intervention trials, there's non-interventional trials. But for this trial, we're going to focus specifically on project management or clinical trial project management of clinical trials of investigational medicinal products. So for TIMPs, so when there's drugs involved, that's really going to be the type of clinical trial project management we're going to talk about. And again, just, ticking the boxes here and looking at the different regulations and legislation. And again, thanks to Rabia for covering this earlier. But we all know that we're really heavily regulated and there's a huge amount of legislation around clinical trials. And our regulator being the HPRA and our National Research Ethics Committee leading the way in particularly for regulated clinical trials. But just to point out that there are all of these regulations and legislations in place, that there are different ones there for medical devices and for clinical trials of investigational medicinal products, and of course we need to follow good clinical practice at all times. Okay, so moving into the topic itself. So when you think of clinical trial project management and the responsibilities, there are a huge amount of responsibilities involved in the project management element of a clinical trial. And a sponsor itself can be a company, an institution, an organisation, a university, an investigator themselves, although it's gotten an awful lot more difficult in recent times for investigators to take on this level of responsibility. But just touching at it at a high level, everything from the initiation, management, insurance, financing of a clinical trial, the coordination of the trial as it happens, the selecting of the sites, the submission to the regulatory authorities, and that's reg and ethics, and indeed local submissions, monitoring of the study as it goes on, data collection and review, statistical analysis and final write-up of studies. These are all project management responsibilities that fall, really to the sponsor or to whoever they delegate for the sponsor tasks. And that's really my comment for this slide. There are so many different elements to clinical trial project management. The sponsor can delegate those tasks out to others, but you need to bear in mind that the sponsor is ultimately responsible at the end of the day for everything, and they have to retain that overall responsibility. So then when we think of a clinical trial project manager, who do you think of? So who comes to your mind straight away when the words clinical trial project manager are said? Is it the sponsor's project manager, so the person who's on the phone to you, at a site level, contacting you about all the things you need to do and the things you haven't yet done? Or is it the CRO who are actually, answering to the sponsor company, who are trying to make sure that everything is done as fast and efficient as possible because they're very much held to timelines that they need to deliver? Or is it the site project manager, the person on the ground who's actually project managing the trial locally, and the person who seems to do an awful lot of the work, certainly on the ground? Or is it the study coordinator, and this could be the research nurse or the research reg who actually has responsibility for the trial locally? And to answer that question, really, the answer is everyone. It's all of these people, that the site project or the clinical trial project management is actually done by quite a few people, and it's never just one person who actually delivers all of these roles and responsibilities. So moving on then, when we think about project management responsibilities, what are all the tasks that this poor project manager or this group of project managers need to do? Well, they need to coordinate the trial from start to finish. They're very often the face of the trial for the sponsor company. They're the person who's contacting the sites, or they're the person on the ground who's making the trial happen. They need to complete the study feasibility and the site selection in the early days. So they're very much out on the ground trying to make sure you've got the right sites and the right people involved. They're the ones then in the background preparing all the study documentation, everything from the protocol and the PILs to all the SOPs that go with it. Very often falls to the project manager as well, or to one of these people who have this role and share these responsibilities. They prepare the plans, and I have plans in inverted commas here, because when it comes to clinical trial project management, there are so many different plans and tools that are out there, and that's brilliant. And I think Rabia's introduction of me probably gave away my age more than anything else, which is obviously moving on in years. But you can see that I have over 20 years experience in clinical trial project management. And back in the day when we were starting out, we didn't have these tools, we didn't have these plans. We were learning as we went on the job. And I think probably the best developments in recent times are these plans, these systematic approaches to clinical trial project management, making it a lot more streamlined, making the collection of the data and the analysis of the data an awful lot more streamlined and indeed safer for patients and those involved. The project manager also has a lot of responsibility when it comes to managing budget and timelines, managing issues at the site, and I'm going to talk about budgets and timelines in a little while again, so moving off on that one quickly. Managing issues, of which all of you know there are many when it comes to clinical trials that can occur at all times or at any stage throughout the course of the trial. Coordinating all of the logistics, everything from, making sure you have the right sites, making sure you have drug at the right site, making sure you have sample kits or whatever it is that you need to have there, making sure you have, the courier available to pick up the samples, whatever it is. There are so many physical logistics to running a clinical trial. And obviously it varies depending on the trial, but the clinical trial project manager is very much the person who has to get all of that in place. Managing monitoring requirements, and again that's a whole topic for another discussion when you're just solely talking about the possibilities and the options when it comes to clinical trial monitoring. I'm really delighted that Rabia again covered off the regulatory requirements already, because that in itself is just enormous, and as you can see from the London Underground map that there are so many pieces to all of that, and we all want a copy of that slide from Rabia for sure. And then coordinating data collection, that's so critical and so important, and making sure you have systems and processes. But again, this is where the project manager or managers come into play. And more. And as I said at the start, I'm not going to cover everything in this talk, but these are just flavours of the work that they have to do. And bearing in mind that they have to do all of these things throughout the life cycle of a clinical trial, which for some trials can be very short and quick. And we saw the wonderful examples of the work that was done by Alistair and his team. But the project management of those large scale trials has been going on for years and will continue for years, and yet you're seeing the results of a set of results from particular trials, and it all seems to be presented so quickly and so efficiently there, but the amount of project management behind all of that has gone on already for years and will continue for years for those projects, and amazing work that's being done there. So moving on to the second part of my trial, I'm just going to focus a little bit more on the clinical trial life cycle and talk to you about the project management throughout the life cycle. So when we think of the life cycle of a clinical trial, there are four key areas to that, or four key stages: project definition, project planning, project implementation, and project closure. And at the definition stage, it's, what's the question? What are we actually going to look at here? And I'm not going to try and, minimize that in any way. That's obviously critical. But it's when you come to the project planning and preparing the clinical trial that the enormous amount of work actually starts, particularly from a clinical trial project management perspective. I'm going to go through each of these four sections in a moment. Clinical trial project implementation, conducting the clinical trial. So that's now you've got the green light, the study is happening, and that's the real time living of the clinical trial and delivering on it. And then of course the closing of the trial and analysing the data and sharing results and archiving material thereafter. So the life cycle, can be said very quickly, but there's so much that needs to happen in each of these phases and throughout the duration of the trial. So taking a closer look, if we look at the project definition, the first phase of the clinical trial life cycle and the responsibilities on project management, well, of course, the protocol has to be developed, and that's deciding, the question, deciding the methodology that you're going to use, deciding, what type of randomization, what type of trial is this going to be. So that development happens, and obviously that can take quite a bit of time depending on the trial and the group that you're working with. Then, of course, the study and protocol feasibility question has to be asked. Well, an investigator can have a brilliant idea and really need the answer to a question, but how feasible is that trial? Will it be possible? Can you do that in the clinical setting that you have available to you? Setting the overall project goals, risks, timelines and budget, and again, say it quickly and it sounds like it's not so bad, but there's a huge amount to that needs to be done. What is the funding envelope that you have for the clinical trial? How, can you afford to do this trial the way you want it? Can you answer the question with the patient populations you have? What are the goals, the risks, the timelines and the budget? There's so much to all of that needs to be thought out at this stage, and you need to get it as best possible right at that point in time. You can, of course, amend your protocols as you go along, but the more you get right up front, the more time and effort you put into getting that right at the start, the more the study will benefit going forward. And of course, you need to identify the study team, who are the right sites, the right people that you want to actually run this trial. And by doing that, then you need to go out and evaluate your sites and select them. Moving on then to the project planning phase, and as I said at the beginning, this is really an enormous part of the project management side of clinical trial. And I've split it here into what happens at a site level and what happens at a sponsor level. So if we specifically look to the different tasks at the sponsor level, everything from, now remember, we've got the protocol sorted in the first stage, so now we're at the next stage where we're planning the trial. So we have to prepare the informed consent form, we have to prepare all these great plans that I've been telling you about, and as I say, I'll come to them again. You have to decide if you want to have a data safety monitoring board if the trial needs it, and that is a topic for another training session, and thanks again to the TMRN. I did a course with you a few months ago which I thought was excellent on data safety monitoring committees and boards, but that needs to be decided at this stage, and that again is a massive topic and a whole different area that needs to be considered. Study procedure manuals and SOPs need to be developed by the sponsor. So how do they want the sites to conduct this trial? Other than over and above the protocol itself, what are the specific procedures that you need for certain tasks, maybe pharmacy manuals, whatever it is that you need to guide the site on. They need to prepare the trial master file and the investigator site file and all of the related documentation that comes with that. And these are such critical elements to the clinical trial project management that they need to be done so well at the beginning. And then, of course, you're just starting with the ethics and competent authority submissions at that stage. And it doesn't stop there. There's the DPIA, the data protection impact assessments, that trials are very much involved in, probably in more recent times than we did in the past. There's the site and vendor contracting. So site contracting can take an enormous amount of time, but vendor contracting is equally important that the sponsor needs to do. The study and product supplies and management, making sure you have the drugs. Can you get them into Ireland? Can you get them to sites? What's the temperature monitoring requirements? All of these elements need to be thought out, and the sites need to be trained on. Coordinating or building the ECRF, or how are you going to capture your data? What's the system you're going to use? So I'm exhausted just reading this slide, not to mind trying to deliver this as a project manager. When you think about it, would you ever take one on? There's so much to do. And then, of course, you have to initiate the sites and train the sites and make sure that they're fully aware of all the different elements of the specific trial. And then, of course, you need to register the clinical trial on, something like clinicaltrials.gov or whichever system you need to you plan on registering your trial on. And I've highlighted in red, in more recent times, the areas that are causing the biggest problems when it comes to clinical trial project management. And it is the DPIA, getting them reviewed in Ireland, getting them accepted by the individual institutions that are involved, standardising a process for this. And this is, as I said, probably over 20 years experience in clinical trial project management and being involved in clinical trials. And some things have come around full circle, as in issues that were there a long time ago are still issues, or they're raising their heads again. But there are also other new issues, new kind of bottlenecks in the system. And at the moment, our biggest, I think, maybe others might disagree, but the DPIA process is really causing us problems at the moment. And site contracting, which I'm afraid to say was a problem quite a long time ago. It's still very much, that nut hasn't been cracked yet. So these are areas that need a lot more work in Ireland, despite the fact that we now have a standardised template by the IPHA for clinical trials of IMPs. Still more work needed on that. Then at a site level, and we're still at section 2 or the phase 2 of the clinical trial life cycle, this is preparing local study procedure manuals. So every site is different and they may have a different way of doing something locally. So every study that has to be thought out. Do we need something specific for our site? And the local informed consent adaptation, again, is there a requirement? Will there be a requirement from the local hospital or the local ethics as to what needs to go in the informed consent form? Local submissions, getting your local hospital approvals, and again there are time delays there, and again all the contracting either with the sponsors or with the vendors for the particular trial. Study setup and planning with other departments. So again, you have to approach your pharmacy. You have to say, we're taking on another clinical trial. Have you got capacity in pharmacy to manage this? You need to agree what are the requirements, how much fridge space will the pharmacy need for this particular trial, and don't underestimate that. That's enormous because every department in a hospital is stretched. Do you have lab facilities? Can you get the radiology assessments done that you need for this trial, or do you need to outsource them? And that's happening quite a lot with clinical trials as well. Study and project supplies management, again making sure you have all the necessary things at a site level and you're storing them appropriately. Can you access the ECRF? Can you use the ECRF? What's the IVRS system? So that's the registration system for the clinical trial. Do you know how to use it? Are you familiar with it of old? Have you access to it, at the site, the area of the hospital that you want to use it when you're randomising a patient, and so on. And then, of course, you have to attend the investigator meetings, the site initiation and protocol training. So there are so many elements, both from a sponsor and a site level in the planning phase. And I would think, again, this is probably the most important phase. Getting this right makes everything else so much easier as you go along. And again, to highlight the two areas that we're seeing the biggest delays at the moment, the local submissions and approvals. Now, some hospitals are better than others. They have streamlined processes in place, but we're seeing a lot of delays around, getting documents assessed at a local level, getting contracts signed off, getting agreement on the specifics for individual hospitals. And, we're getting feedback from the pharmaceutical companies that, it's taking too long. Their interest in doing trials in Ireland is waning on occasion, and we need to be careful about that and try and streamline those processes for Ireland. So moving on then, right, we've got the green light, we've got all the planning done, and we're now finally allowed to open the trial. From a sponsor level then, there's an enormous responsibility and amount of work at this stage. So everything from site monitoring and follow-up of management of the monitoring, making sure you're following up on issues that are raised and not leaving things to a later date. Study and product supplies management, making sure there's enough drug at site when a trial is happening, making sure it's all in date, making sure that if there were any issues with the temperature monitoring of the drug, that you're on top of all of that, and that the products are safe to use at all time. There's inevitably protocol amendments. We'd love to say we started and finished a trial without having an amendment, but unfortunately in the real world protocols are constantly being amended. And when you look at the samples that Alistair gave us this morning, they were being amended for the right reason, the new addition of new therapies, and those platform trials are just prime examples of the importance of being able to amend your protocol as you go along. SAE, so safety reporting, SUSARs, the importance of that, the importance of having a system in place to be able to deliver that in real time, 24/7, is really important. And the sponsor has to have that system in place. And then, of course, if you've decided to have a data safety monitoring board for your trial, you have to have the meetings and you have to feed the advice back to the investigators and those running the trial. Budget maintenance and payment, you need to, there's nothing going to frustrate a site more than not getting paid for their trial when they should be. So the sponsor has to make sure they're on top of all of that. Study status evaluation and reporting. So you'll have made a decision when you're going to report, you're going to do interim analysis. So you need to carry out all of that in a timely manner throughout the course of the trial at the sponsor level. You need to coordinate the data management and other data collection and cleaning. So if you're going to be looking at data interim analysis, you need to make sure that you're able to clean the data as you're going and that you're able to report on that. And of course you need to manage your vendors as the sponsor project management side of things. So everything from the collection of samples that the couriers are collecting on time and the correct procedures, they're bringing them to the appropriate labs, or if you're using third-party radiology, that all that is being done according to the protocol. So again, enormous amount of work there for the sponsor. And then on the ground at the site, again, a huge amount of responsibility and work for the project management responsibilities there. Everything from following the protocol, the subject schedule and assessments, making sure you're following it to the letter of the law, allowing monitoring, being able to facilitate monitors when they're coming, having that schedule of monitoring agreed in advance. Being able to allow audits to be conducted and to follow up on any reports that are there from any audit findings. And again, it's very much the responsibility of the site to make sure that the products, the drug they have on site, the lab kits they have on site, whatever it is, that the supply they have is adequate, and also that it is within date. And so they need to liaise very carefully and closely with the sponsor on that to make sure that they have supplies when needed. And then, of course, they need to do the local submission. So if you have the sponsor doing amendments and they're feeding it back to the site, then the site needs to follow through on any of those amendments, and don't enact any protocol until you have the full approval for it locally. They need to make sure that they're on top of the safety reporting side of the trial as well, that they are reporting SAEs as they happen and that they're following through on them and that they're carrying out the necessary requirements should a SUSAR be identified. Invoice generation, so I mentioned to you that nobody will be happy with the sponsor if they're not paying, but the site needs to make sure that they're invoicing appropriately and be on top of that side of things as well. Subject and site documentation management. Obviously they need to make sure that that is up to scratch and that they have completed their trial master file and they have all the documentations, and they need to be audit ready every minute and hour of the day. You can't just start scrambling in the weeks in advance of an audit. I say you can't, I'm sure it happens all the time, but in the ideal world the trial master file and the site file are audit ready 24/7. And that's what you'd hope for. And then, of course, making sure the data collection and query answering. So if you have a sponsor and they're collecting the data and they're frantically trying to get it cleaned because they have an interim analysis or it's coming close to the end of the study and they're asking you queries about the data, it's really important that the project management or managers at site are responsive on that and answering the queries and following through on all of that. And then finally we get to stage 4 in the clinical trial life cycle, which is the closure of the trial and the analysing the data. And again, there's 2 very long lists here. Well, actually just one, thankfully. And I think I have it for both the sponsor and the site as well. But documentation, reconciliation and archiving. Again, there's so much archiving now that needs to be done. The trial master file needs to be archived for 25 years with the new regulations. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done there. And again, you have to have a suitable vendor for archiving that will take it off site if that's what your preference is. You need to make sure that you're taking the supplies back from site, that you're just destroying them if they're not going to be reused for something else. You need to make sure that the ethics and competent authority are notified, that all fees are paid up to date. You need to make sure the data is ready for the database lock and that it's closed, and that you carry out a full site closure. And then it's analysing the data and writing up the reports and publication. And again, if you say all that quickly, it sounds like it's no bother, but it's an enormous amount of work to that. And then when you look at the site level, the project closure, everything from making sure that the documentation is ready for archiving, that the trial supplies are ready for return and destruction, that any local ins of study notifications are given, and that you've done your invoices. So you close it all out, and finally you can get to the end from a site perspective. Now, I was careful about putting stop on the sponsor one and the end on the site side, because the trial does not necessarily stop once the study is stopped. That's all of the reporting, there's all of the archiving, there's so much more behind the scenes, particularly from a sponsor perspective. So while the trial may have stopped, it may not be the end for the sponsor, but it may be the end for the site until they can see their name and lights on the publication. Moving on then to the third part of my presentation, and I'll go through this fairly quickly because I'm probably running out of time at this stage. I don't know who's on my clock here. Yeah, great. 3 minutes, great. So this is just a very boring old phrase, but it's so true for clinical trials. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail, and it's so true in clinical trials. And this is just a sample set of the different types of clinical trial project management plans that you can use. Everything from the project plan, human resources, task allocation, budget matrix, and it goes on down through a list of 10. And this is where you're probably going to say, but what about there's loads. There are so many different elements to clinical trial project management, and I'm very thankful for these plans that have come into play over the years. And I've just decided to give a whistle-stop tour through the top 5 that have had such impact on the trials that I was involved in down through the years. And the first is the clinical trial project plan, and making sure that at the very beginning this is identified very clearly. Everything from setting the expected timelines to the project management tools to all your Gantt charts that the HRB love, and we all love to complete and submit to them, but they're so valuable because you can actually see where the trial is going to go. Identifying your tasks and deliverables up front for your trial and trying to keep to those timelines are so important, but using the tools that are available out there for that. The task allocation matrix probably came into effect probably 15 years ago, but before that we were working where I was going, you're doing that, yeah, right, okay, and we're doing this, great. And, it just seems crazy that you would run a trial without having that type of, clear definition of what people are doing. So these task allocation matrices, and I've just given you a link there to a sample one. There are many versions of this that are out there that the Corporate Enabling of Clinical Research project delivered, and that's a link to their full document, and you'll find different tools there. Clinical trial budget planning, and I don't know, I'm sure you've all seen Dermot Bannon and his house renovations programme, and in theory, the variance in clinical trial project management is -10 to +20% on the overall cost of any general project. I've never seen Dermot Bannon go anything less than 20% over budget. So that's wrong to start with. But in a clinical trial, it's even more difficult to predict the cost because things can change as the trial goes on. So often there are so many different elements to a clinical trial that can cause the budget to change. So the guidance is to have a budget available of ±30%. Which is really high and quite scary. The risk management plan is another tool that's available on the corporate enabling document, and this has really come into play in more recent years, and a requirement now from a regulatory perspective that you identify your risk, you evaluate your risk, and you control your risk throughout the course of the clinical trial. You put in your corrective action plans as you're going and make sure that it's done appropriately. And also then the monitoring plan is another tool you can't do without now. You need to make sure that you have your monitoring defined up front. The risk-based approach is very much the way to go now, and I'm just going to finish up by saying, as we all know, if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. And I particularly liked this one that I pulled while preparing for this trial, or for this presentation today. In the eyes of the FDA, if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. We all know that. If it isn't written down properly, you're not sure exactly what actually happened. And if the records aren't correct, neither is the product. And that's very much the rule of thumb that the FDA and all of us adhere to. And that's it. Thank you very much.